Today's going to be a tough one because I've taken a look back through the years to dig up some painful memories. These are the watches that fill me with regret, the ones that let me down by not meeting the promise of my probably self-imposed expectations. It's not that I'm angry at them, just disappointed. The last one's got real end of the video energy. Let me begin with a caveat of sorts. None of the watches I've ever purchased have actually been bad watches. As in, they've all managed to hang onto my wrist and tell the time with a reasonable degree of accuracy. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, "Wow, a Rolex, I bet it tells the time really well." Like there's some secret rich person time that actually goes up to 30 hours a day. So since we're not really buying them for that, my expectations are linked more towards an intangible sense of satisfaction, which is measured by pretty much one metric. Does it make my balls tingle? I couldn't possibly quantify the enormous amounts of mathematics that go into the process of making them tingle or not, except to say the watches in this list failed that test. For you, some of them might make your balls, assuming you have them, fizz like a firework. Your mileage, as they say, may vary. Different roads, different car, different driver. With that aside, the first watch is the Rolex GMT-Master II. Yeah, so you can see why I said all that before, because you're probably rating me somewhere around the mud-eating level on the idiot scale right about now. I'll give you some context. Before I had the GMT-Master II, which to be more specific was the first ceramic edition, I had the non-ceramic Submariner. That was a cool watch that got the old undernuggets bubbling away at gas mark 10. As you may know, I upgraded one for t'other because I assumed newer and shinier would be better, but it turns out that Leo DiCaprio was wrong, and that's not always the case. What was the case was a thicker, chunkier piece of steel that felt sturdier, heftier, like someone had taken the old one and sent it to buds, and by all accounts that should be an improvement. To me though, it didn't feel like it. It felt to me more like the kind of watch they'd give you when you've got one arm shorter than the other. Funny thing is that Rolex rolled that case out into the Submariner as well and have since reversed course a bit, slimming down the lugs and getting a feeling closer in proportion to that pre-ceramic watch. But they haven't for the GMT for some reason. Even to this day, it continues to clump about with its stumpy lugs that look a bit like they got too friendly with the belt sander. Before I was even aware of the word Rolex, I knew I liked watches. My dad had a Tag Heuer, I had a Seiko. Both quartz, I had no idea about mechanical back then, and I really wanted to take the leap between the two. I think you could comfortably get a used Tag Heuer for around £500 to £1,000 back then, which was simply too much money for me. But I found a local auction selling some watches with low reserves, one of which was a Tag Heuer F1, same as my dad's. I think they anticipated it selling for around £300 or something. I had just about £300, and so off I went to this auction. The Tag Heuer was the first lot on the block, and before I knew it, it was gone. £300. So cheap. Gutted I'd missed it. So, of course, I naturally left empty-handed and went home to fight another day, didn't I? Don't be silly. I got FOMO and bid on the next watch, which I ended up winning. £300. Some brand I don't even remember. Something I'd not even seen or had any idea about. I just bought it for the same reason I do YouTube. A desperate need for validation. I've since learnt that's the entire setup of these things, and on one hand it's reassuring to know I'm not the only mug in Mugtown. But on the other, it's frustrating to think that I was an easier play than Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. The watch was this gaudy thing with fake diamonds on the dial and a chunky polished case, and I tried wearing it and pretending I wasn't a complete doofus, but it just didn't work. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded how the auctioneer rode me like a beach donkey. As it happens, the watch itself wasn't awful quality. It was quartz and it told the time, but it was basically like having my own personal bully following me around, telling me how much I sucked. I tried selling it, but no one would buy it. Clearly the populace of eBay was smarter than I was. So I literally put it in the bin. I probably should have given it to a charity shop or something in hindsight, but there was something cathartic about seeing it in amongst the banana peels and hula hoop packets. You may have already heard the story of my first mechanical watch acquisition, but I don't really think I've explained why it didn't work out. Back when I was just discovering that watches weren't all powered by batteries around 15 to 20 years ago, for whatever reason, the watch I was drawn to was a U-boat, the Flightdeck 50. I can't even recall how I managed to bypass Omega, Tag Heuer, Breitling, etc. and ended up at U-boat, but I distinctly recall being aware of Panerai as well. In my mind, I had associated mechanical quality with sheer heft and slab-sidedness, because that worked out really well for Lada. I also had in my mind that the hype around Panerai would somehow rub off onto the pseudo-Italian war watch that was the U-boat, which I could purchase cheaper and potentially not lose money on. Whatever the reason, I purchased one, and then tried very hard to convince myself that I was definitely someone who enjoyed wearing a landmine on my wrist. Like, this thing was a beast. It was 50mm across and thicker than a church door. They'd also engraved the logo on the side like they were expecting it back. I actually still quite like the dial. Bold, clear and colourful in the bright neon yellow I chose. And ultimately it was my first ownership experience of a watch powered exclusively by a piece of bent metal. But good lord was I disappointed. I was probably as much disappointed with myself as I was the watch, since I had a ruler at home, so it wouldn't have been hard to figure out that it was too big before I bought it. Honestly, it was more like strapping on a shield than it was a watch. I felt like Captain America, except the U-boat could probably do more damage. I didn't have to worry about door frames. They had to worry about me. And there wasn't a cuff in the world big enough to contain it. Not even close. Even Austin Powers would struggle. It was a moment in my life where I had to acknowledge that I had done f***ed up. I'd spent a lot of money on something I didn't much like, and neither did anyone else. There was no Panerai effect. I did lose money, and lessons were learnt. Well, maybe. Apparently it took a while for that lesson to sink in, because what I bought next was also the size of a small bus. But in fairness to me, 46mm sounded a lot smaller than 50mm. What I hadn't reckoned was how big 46mm can be, especially when it's square. Yes, my next disappointing choice came from the French house of Bell & Ross, makers of aviation instruments for the wrist, the BR-0192. Now, hear me out, because despite having the constitution of a wounded gazelle, I had a long-standing desire to fly fast jets in the Air Force, and I loved anything and everything to do with aviation. If it flies but doesn't lay eggs, I'm into it. When I saw a watch company was making mechanical watches that looked like the dials in my favourite aircraft, the McDonnell Douglas F4 Phantom, I knew there and then a bad decision was imminent. Once bitten, twice shy is what they say, but the reality here for me was that I needed to be bitten again just to make sure the first time wasn't an accident. Quelle surprise! When you stand out in a storm brandishing a big metal object, lightning can indeed strike twice. In this case, that big metal object was PVD coated black and had all the grace and elegance of a Huddersfield hen do. And at first, I liked it, but then I saw myself in the mirror with it and had one of those "is that what I look like?" moments that completely turned the tide. What did I look like? I looked like a skinny guy in my early 20s with a set of weighing scales hanging off one arm. I looked like someone had stuck a meat thermometer in me to see if I was done. It was a tragic sight, and I've been to Israel. You may well ask why I didn't purchase the smaller BR-03. Good question. I didn't like the date. Yes, I'd rather look like a representative of the Department of Weights and Measures than have a date ruining the dial. I think the fact that Bell & Ross still makes the 03 and not the larger 01 says it all. The silliest thing is that after all that, I still have a hankering for the BR-03 51 GMT Titanium. Maybe I should reconsider my position as someone who offers advice on watches. Oh well, lesson learnt. Or was it? Spoiler, it wasn't, because that Panerai I wanted at the beginning was still occupying a comfortably decent amount of real estate up in the old thinker. They were still too much for me, around £1,000 or so more than the Bell & Ross, so if I was to get one, I'd have to make sure I absolutely committed 100% and made no rash decisions. So check this out for a bit of clever thinking. I purchased an unbranded Homage. I think it was a few £100 or so, and it was just like the basic Luminor Marina, but for whatever reason it was in titanium. There was a Chinese version of the Unitas 6498 in the back, and it was actually pretty alright. It was so alright that it completely stopped me wanting the Panerai at all. Or at least, that's what I had secretly wished would happen. Like, you know when you do something in the hope that you can trick your own brain, as if somehow you think it's not paying attention to your scheming. For example, if I get this cheaper watch, it'll stop me wanting this more expensive one. Yeah, no, that works about as well as a marshmallow anchor. I still wanted the Panerai, and yes, I'd made this purchase in order to safeguard the purchase of a Panerai. But if you'll remember, I said that a Panerai was still too much for me, and now I was a few £100 or so further away and even more certain that I wanted one. So I'm sure you can guess what happened next. I bought a Panerai. Yes, because why have money for food and other essentials when you can dress up as your favourite Axis power? But it gets better still, because I didn't do the sensible thing and replicate what I already owned in the Homage, but with the Panerai name on the dial. I pushed my finger too far up my nose, gave it a wiggle, and decided to purchase one that was completely different. Before you brand me as the biggest brain since the Tide Pod challenge, hear me out. I'd already had that Panerai. So for the Panerai I actually Panerai'd, I wanted to Panerai different. So I shuffled from the classic square-sided Luminor into the 1950s style curvy PAM 312. In theory, it was a more original, more authentic Luminor experience, and I assumed that could only be a good thing. Yeah, nah. I'd set myself up squarely to fail again. Not only did the actual Panerai wear much bigger than the one it replaced, I also, and I realise how stupid this sounds, preferred the way the smaller one looked too. It was simpler, less fussy, more compact, much like my brain, apparently. It was instant cold regret the moment I got the Panerai. Because I purchased it pre-owned at distance, I didn't get a chance to try it on first, so I was lumbered with a watch that, try as I might, I really didn't get on with. Later down the line, I ended up with a 512, which I absolutely loved, but unfortunately, this one left me colder than an Antarctic outhouse. Naturally, both forms of Panerai eventually left my care, leaving me somewhat poorer in pocket, but richer in spirit. No, that's not true. I'm just trying to be positive. Now, I think this next one's going to come as a surprise to you maybe, I don't know. Even though I think everyone should choose their own watches and there shouldn't be any rules, this is the one watch I think everyone should try at least once, the Speedmaster. Because I was trying to be a bit too smart for my own boots, bad move considering how well that had gone for me up to then, I decided that going straight for the classic MoonWatch was a bit too obvious. I fancied myself as a bit more left field than that, so I picked out one from the automatic series instead. It had a white dial and blue hands and markers, with the hand shape matching the original Speedmaster's broad arrow style. It also had a date window at 6, which I don't mind because it's symmetrical and hasn't embraced its inner Italian cruise ship captain and wandered off course. Even today, in theory, I really like this watch. The blue is lovely, the automatic caliber is more convenient, and the white dial gives it a really strong contrast. But it's just wrong. I can't place my finger on why exactly, but it's something to do with the fact that it looks a bit like one of those weird cave creatures that never gets to see the sunlight. It's got that creepy albino feel, like I'm going to wake up in the night and it's going to be stood at the end of my bed staring at me. My time with that watch was short, far shorter than the actual MoonWatch that went on to replace it, and then I very firmly, absolutely 100% learnt my lesson to stick to the classics, no mucking about. Except this time I really did stick to my guns. So that Bell & Ross, the pilot thing, flying for the RAF, that itch remained unscratched, nagging at me like an aching tooth that I should really get looked at. So you can imagine that there was literally only one watch that could fulfill this particular niche, the IWC Pilot's Watch Mark 16. It's an evolution of the watch IWC made for RAF pilots from 1948, as more local business had since dried up, and I did my absolute best to make sure that, this time, it was the watch I was looking for. It wasn't too big, it wasn't too thick, it wasn't too garish, and it most certainly wasn't too stupid. I was right. It was none of those things. It was entirely practical, sensible, and robust. It was the most boring watch I'd ever owned. I don't know why this came as a surprise to me, because it was built literally to provide the most solid, basic watch experience possible. As far as watches go, it couldn't be more simple if it were two-dimensional and featured in an AHA video. There's not even a single drop of colour. It's the watch equivalent of the Monday morning commute. I didn't hate it, I just didn't like it either. It was just there. I would check the time, and the time would be there, and I would think, ah, that is the time. I think it might have been turning me German, actually. Every time I looked at it, I got the urge to spill over onto my co-worker's desk. This comes back to the theory of what watch works for you and what doesn't. In theory, on paper, this was the perfect watch, and I'm sure for other people it genuinely is, but for me, it's hard to say it was even disappointing. It was a void of emotion, a black hole for my enthusiasm that simply left me feeling empty. Or maybe that's just childhood trauma. Now I think about it, perhaps it was because my dream of being a fighter pilot had been thwarted by bad eyesight, and that wearing this thing was actually a constant reminder of my own failure to live up to the expectations I'd set myself from as early as I can remember. Yeah, maybe that was it. One of the biggest disappointments I've ever experienced surprisingly comes with one of the cheapest watches I've ever purchased. If the MoonWatch is for best, this one's for cleaning the bog. Yes, it's the Swatch MoonSwatch. Because everything is better with bioceramic, I purchased 2 of these, one for me and one for my wife. And even with the lowest of the low expectations, given all the media that had gone on before I was able to get hold of one, it still somehow managed to lower the bar. There was this whole thing with Swatch saying it wasn't plastic, it was bioceramic. But whatever that actually is, I'm pretty sure plastic is better. Bioceramic feels about as robust as a Bognor Regis sandcastle, and I'm pretty sure it's made from leftover Babybel. Not the outer wax, the actual cheese. It feels more fragile than my self-esteem and has the life expectancy of a baby sea turtle, but all that is nothing compared to the strap. Compared to the strap, the watch itself is the oldest of horologies, because the strap may well be the most disappointing thing since Brutus asked Caesar if he wanted to feel a little prick. Honestly, if the case is bad, the strap is 1,000 times worse. I've seen higher quality material in landfill. It feels like a cat's tongue, and wears the same semi-gloss finish as a sun-baked slug. I would sooner wear the MoonSwatch as a pocket watch than on that hate crime of a strap. To throw fire ants on the wound, I recently saw the new Mission on Earth series in person, since it's actually readily available. In pictures, I thought they looked really cool, but again, in person they let me down so much I thought I was a bouncy castle at the end of a kid's party. If I didn't know better, I'd say they'd sat in that window getting bleached by the sun for a good few decades. Okay, so this last one isn't a watch I've actually owned, but it's more of a never meet your heroes kind of thing. It's a watch I'd never managed to see in person, but had been hyped up so much it was practically royalty. I'm talking about the Patek Philippe Nautilus 5711. If you know anything about watches, you'll probably know about this. It's the watch that gets everyone giddy with its slim lines and flappy ears, deep blue dial and tapered bracelet. It's a watch that I had been very much looking forward to meeting, especially since I had enjoyed my own Royal Oak so much, and I assumed it would be a similar but even more elevated experience. I was very, very wrong. The Royal Oak was a sturdy thing, milled from chunks of steel so solid you could scratch your name in the wall with them. By contrast, the 5711 couldn't be more flimsy if they'd fashioned it from chewing gum wrappers, which I think is exactly what they did. The bracelet feels so thin I don't know whether to wear it or make it a hot meal. But the bracelet has the structural solidity of the Flatiron building in comparison to the clasp. Yes, in a twist even M. Night Shyamalan didn't see coming, the 5711 went all MoonSwatch with a bracelet locking mechanism that draws its engineering inspiration from the Solo Cup. You'd be better off holding the watch to your wrist with a tapeworm. The 5811 goes an incredibly long way to reversing this experience, with the use of weighty white gold and a proper clasp with micro extensions, but holding the original simply cannot be topped for the most deflating watch experience I've ever had. And remember, if you're thinking about buying a watch and you're just not sure about it, never ask me for advice. Seriously, if you've learnt just one thing from this, it's that I'm an idiot. See you next time.